You probably think of the Ottoman Empire as a sprawling, timeless power, an ancient dynasty stretching across continents, held together by swords and sultans, fading into history with the romantic aura of exotic palaces and grand battles. But that image is the first trap. The Ottoman Empire was not just a medieval relic. It was, in its prime, a colossal economic machine, one of the most intricately balanced systems of extraction, finance, and trade before the modern nation-state emerged. Behind the crescent flags and dusty archives lies a harsh truth. The Ottoman economy was less about prosperity and more about perpetual survival, a delicate dance between overstretched resources, shifting trade flows, fiscal innovation, and violent debt crises. Understanding how this empire managed its finances, how it fed its armies, governed its provinces, raised revenues, spent on wars, and borrowed against its future, is the key to seeing why it lasted 6 centuries, yet inevitably crumbled under the weight of its own economic contradictions. At first glance, the Ottoman Empire appears to be a classic land-based autocracy, held together by conquest and military might, ruled by a sultan who controlled an enormous territory stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia and the ports of North Africa. We imagine taxes as simple tributes on peasants or plunder from conquered peoples. But the reality was far more complex. The empire's true economic engine was a vast system of tax farming, state monopolies, long-distance trade revenues, and heavily layered bureaucracy that turned political control into financial extraction. It was the world's largest creditor for centuries, at least among pre-modern states. A borrower from merchant financiers in Venice, Genoa, and later Europe, all tangled in networks of trust and credit that transcended borders. The Ottoman economy was fundamentally about transforming the chaos of a diverse, multi-ethnic empire into a steady, albeit fragile, stream of cash. This empire did not finance itself just by overwhelming wealth or natural resources. Its wealth was in controlling flow, trade routes, transit tariffs, taxation rights, monopolies on goods like salt, silk, and arms. But collection was never easy. Unlike European states that shifted increasingly towards centralized tax systems, the Ottomans operated through the timar system, a form of feudal land tenure where provincial elites were granted the right to collect taxes in exchange for military service. This created 2 problems. First, it fragmentized fiscal authority, making direct control tenuous. Second, it depended on constant military campaigns to replenish conquered territory and maintain the value of tax farms. Once expansion slowed in the 17th century, the whole system started to strain. Provinces could withhold revenue, local elites became semi-autonomous, and the central treasury was forced to innovate and increasingly borrow to plug gaps. Contrary to what many think, the Ottoman treasury did not keep gold and silver reserves like a modern central bank. Instead, it functioned more as a ledger of promises and debts. Its revenues were tied to short-term collection rights, subject to fluctuations in harvests, war spoils, and trade taxes. The empire's innovative financial institutions included the rise of the arpalic, a kind of temporary land grant given to bureaucrats for personal upkeep, a clear sign of chronic liquidity problems. Even more revealing was the development of the iltism system, where tax farms were auctioned off to the highest bidder, effectively outsourcing the state's tax collection at the cost of increasing corruption and oppression of local populations. The government often ended up supporting these tax farmers with loans, weaving a complex web of debt not just internally, but internationally as well. By the late 16th century, the empire was the biggest debtor in the known world. Its repeated defaults created waves that rippled through the Mediterranean's financial hubs. Venetian bankers who lent to the Ottomans could expect irregular payments, forced restructurings, and political risk that transcended mere economic calculation. Each military campaign, whether the siege of Vienna, naval wars in the Mediterranean, or internal rebellions, was funded by more extraordinary debt issuance, forcing the treasury to compromise liquidity for short-term survival. Yet the Sultan's court remained lavish, invested heavily in the ceremonials of power, architectural marvels like the Topkapi Palace, and an expansive bureaucracy that helped legitimize and manage extraction. The empire's commerce was equally revealing. It thrived as an interface between Europe and Asia, a crucial linkage on the Silk Road and spice routes. Istanbul was a financial center, where merchant guilds and ethnic minorities, Armenians, Jews, Greeks played key roles as intermediaries. But the economic picture was uneven. The imperial policy often veered toward monopolies and state interference, which stifled domestic entrepreneurship and redirected wealth toward controlling elites and foreign intermediaries. The Ottoman state wanted to profit not only from its own subjects, but also by taxing and regulating foreign merchants, turning Istanbul, Aleppo, and Izmir into entrepôts, gateways to Eastern markets controlled by European powers hungry for access. However, the imperial economy had critical dependencies that eventually undermined it. The rise of Atlantic trade routes in the 17th and 18th centuries marginalized Ottoman-controlled land routes. The discovery of the Americas and the opening of the Cape of Good Hope route siphoned off the volume and profits of trade passing through Ottoman territory. Simultaneously, internal structural problems, ethnic tensions, provincial autonomy, shrinking arable land under Timurs, intensified budgetary shortfalls. The steady stream of revenue was replaced by borrowing from European banks and, most damagingly, from wealthy local elites who lent at exorbitant rates, effectively becoming creditors who controlled the political system from behind the scenes. It was not just an economic crisis, it was a systemic crisis of legitimacy and governance dressed in financial terms. When the empire began to modernize in the 19th century, the Tanzimat reforms, these efforts were driven primarily by the need to stabilize finances, centralize tax collection, and borrow on international capital markets with better credit ratings. But here, the Ottomans became hopelessly entangled in a debt trap. By 1875, the empire declared bankruptcy, the first sovereign default of the modern era. European creditors imposed financial control that opened the door to political interference, laying bare the fact that control of the Ottoman economy was inseparable from control of the empire itself. The Ottoman debt crisis was also a geopolitical turning point. It marked a shift where economic dependency equaled political dependency. The establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, managed by European powers, illustrates how finance became an instrument of empire, yet reversed. Instead of the Ottomans extracting wealth, they were becoming a debtor colony, subordinate to foreign banks and governments who now had direct stakes in Ottoman territory and resources. This financial colonization hastened the empire's unraveling, and would later feed into the nationalist struggles that finally dissolved its territories after World War I. Behind this long story lies a fundamental economic paradox. The Ottoman Empire's longevity depended on continuous extraction and expansion. Its fiscal engines were built on growth, conquest, and the constant reinvestment of resources into military power. But once growth slowed, that model became unsustainable. State elites adapted through credit, monopolies, and bureaucratic rent-seeking. But this was a fragile house of cards. The core issue was never just about taxes or battles. It was the nature of pre-modern empires as forced economies of survival, where the costs of maintaining power steadily outstripped genuine economic development. What looks like majesty and power was, in reality, a precarious balance between debt, extraction, and shifting market forces. The Ottoman Empire teaches us that empires are not simply political or military phenomena. They are deeply embedded economic machines. They are financial ecosystems that must manage flows of money, labor, and commodities, while controlling often hostile populations and competing states. The long Ottoman experiment reveals the fragility beneath imperial grandeur, woven through with the same financial risks and political debts that still shape the world today. To truly understand the Ottoman Empire, you must look behind the conquest stories, behind the palaces and armies, and see the economy in full view. A vast, interconnected system of tax auctions, trade monopolies, war debts, and bureaucratic complexity. It was a machine designed to feed an ever-hungry state, balancing on debt, credit, and control. And in its collapse, it offers a timeless lesson. Power sustained by fragile financial engineering is the first to crumble, not just in empires, but in every empire's infinite echo.